Rick Lawson, 76 years old, a former Navy SEAL once known as the Ghost Walker, walked quietly into Patriot Arms, a small-town gun shop, on a scorching afternoon. He wasn't there to demand attention. He just wanted to hold an M1 Garand, the rifle that had once saved his team's lives in missions no one ever heard about. But the staff didn't see a hero. They saw an old man. They mocked his limp, laughed at his quiet request, and kicked him out, pushing him into the parking lot like he was no one. 1 hour later, a convoy of black SUVs arrived. 12 SEALs men Rick had once carried through fire walked in without a word. No threats, no raised voices, just a silent formation that made the air in the shop turn heavy, freezing every smirk and every joke mid-breath. That day the town learned something it hadn't asked for, that some heroes walk among us quietly, asking for nothing but they are never alone. And when you disrespect one, you answer to all. Where are you watching from today? Tell us in the comments and stay with us, because this is a story that will remind you why some names deserve to be remembered forever. The Arizona sun scorched the asphalt in front of Patriot Arms, waves of heat rising off the cracked parking lot. Richard Rick Lawson, 76 years old, moved slowly, his limp noticeable, as he adjusted the strap of his old canvas bag. He had just stepped off the sidewalk when Jason, the security guard, followed him outside. Without warning, Jason's hand landed on Rick's shoulder. "You're done here, old man. Move along." The shove wasn't brutal, but for a man with a stiff leg and old injuries, it was enough. Rick stumbled forward, his foot catching slightly on the uneven concrete at the edge of the lot. He went down hard, landing on his knees and hands with a muted grunt. His bag slipped from his shoulder and skidded a few feet away, resting against the hot metal of a parked car. For a long second, everything was still. Inside the gun shop, the young manager Mike watched briefly from behind the counter, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Sarah, the cashier, barely glanced up from her phone. Jason stood at the entrance, arms folded across his chest, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. None of them made a move to help. Outside, the heat shimmered the air, thick with dry dust. Rick pushed himself up slowly, movements careful not because of pain, he was used to that, but from the practiced caution of a man who knew how to survive without help. His hands were scraped, but he said nothing. He brushed the grit off his palms, picked up his bag, and adjusted his shoulder strap. His breathing stayed, even his jaw clenched but calm. Without a word, he limped away from the door, heading toward the far side of the parking lot, where his old truck sat baking in the sun. Near the edge of the lot, a young man in a gray hoodie had been leaning against his car, watching the scene unfold. His eyes widened as Rick hit the ground. Instinctively, the man fumbled for his phone, flicking on the camera app. "You seeing this?" he muttered, voice barely above a whisper. He started recording the phone, held up shakily as he zoomed in. "They just shoved that old guy. Jesus, who the hell is he?" The camera captured every step as Rick moved across the lot, each limp exaggerated by the uneven ground, the sun glinting off the faded badge on his cap. The young man kept filming, his voice now mixed with disbelief and anger. "What the hell are they doing to him? Someone needs to see this." Within 15 minutes, the video hit social media, spreading like wildfire. Local feeds filled with shares, reposts, and angry comments from people who didn't know the man in the video but recognized mistreatment when they saw it. "Who is this guy?" someone posted. "Why are they treating an old veteran like trash?" another demanded. Hashtags began to pile up. "Respect our vets," Sidewalker, Patriot Arms incident, which. At that moment, Rick didn't know he was going viral. He kept walking slowly, deliberately, making his way toward the far edge of the lot. His breath was steady. His face composed, his mind somewhere else entirely. Not in the parking lot, not in the heat, but in the discipline that had carried him through things far worse than this. But not everyone who saw what happened was just an online observer. Across the lot, partly hidden by the shadow of a hardware store awning, a woman stood watching. She was in her late 30s, dressed simply in a faded gym shirt and jeans, a ball cap pulled low over dark hair, mirrored sunglasses reflecting the sun. Her arms were crossed tightly, jaw set, expression unreadable. She hadn't moved the entire time, eyes locked on Rick's retreating figure. The camera didn't catch her, and no one in the parking lot noticed. Calmly, almost casually, she pulled a small phone from her pocket and lifted it to her ear. Her lips barely moved as she spoke 3 words, quiet but clear. He was there. Without another glance, she turned and walked away. And back inside Patriot Arms, the staff remained unaware of the storm already starting to brew across the internet, and even more unaware of the silent signal that had just been set in motion, one that had nothing to do with hashtags or angry comments. Something was coming for them, and they would never see it coming. Just minutes earlier inside Patriot Arms, a simple request had gone horribly wrong. Inside Patriot Arms, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights mixed with the soft twang of a country song drifting from the ceiling speakers. Rick Lawson stood at the counter, his old canvas bag slung over his shoulder, his faded SEAL Team 4 cap sitting snug on his silver hair. He wasn't here to browse aimlessly. His eyes were fixed on one thing, the M1 Garand mounted on the back wall, the same kind of rifle he'd once carried across steaming jungles and muddy battlefields. "Mind if I take a look at that M1 Garand?" Rick asked softly, his voice calm but steady. Behind the counter, Mike, the young manager, barely lifted his eyes from the inventory tablet. "That's a display piece, sir," he said flatly. "Not for handling." Rick gave a small nod, not surprised. "I don't want to buy it. I just want to hold it, feel the weight again. It's been a long time." Sarah, the cashier, glanced up briefly, eyebrows raised. Without a word, she went back to scrolling her phone. From the far side of the shop, Pete, the floor clerk, ambled over, a grin tugging at his mouth. Pete was young, cocky, eager to show off. He leaned against the glass display, arms folded, eyes dancing with amusement. "Sir, I don't mean to offend, but that rifle's no toy. Might be a bit much for your back." You know, Rick's jaw tensed slightly, but his voice stayed level. "I used to carry one just like it for miles, son." Pete snorted softly, exchanging a glance with Mike. "All right, Rambo. Maybe save the war stories for the VFW, huh? This isn't a museum tour." Mike leaned back, eyes cool and dismissive. "Sir, we need to keep the counter clear for customers looking to buy. If you're not planning to make a purchase, I'll have to ask you to step aside." The words hung in the air. Rick's fingers tightened slightly on the strap of his bag. His eyes passed slowly from Mike to Pete, then to Sarah, who still hadn't looked up again. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. Without a word, he gave a small nod. As Rick turned toward the door, Mike smirked faintly, shaking his head. "Old guys like that think the world owes them something," he muttered under his breath. Pete snickered, tapping his knuckles lightly on the glass. "Yeah, you'd think he was some kind of war hero or something." Sarah looked up at last, watching Rick's slow, deliberate steps toward the entrance. "You shouldn't have poked at him like that," she murmured softly. Pete raised his eyebrows, shrugging. "Relax. It's not like he's anyone important." Just then, Mike gave a small wave toward the back, signaling to Jason, the security guard. Jason, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped forward, watching as Rick neared the door. "Make sure he's on his way out," Mike said quietly. Jason gave a sharp nod, moving to position himself by the entrance. Rick, unaware of the exchange, adjusted his bag again, taking careful, measured steps toward the door. His right leg, stiff from an old injury, dragged slightly, but his posture remained steady, his shoulders squared. Inside, the staff settled back into their routine, laughing softly among themselves, their attention already drifting away. They couldn't have known that the small moment they had just brushed off was about to ripple far beyond the walls of their little store. Rick reached the door and paused briefly, his hand brushing the edge of the frame. For just a second, he closed his eyes, exhaling slowly, centering himself the way only a man trained in discipline and endurance could. Then he stepped outside into the glaring Arizona sun. And with that, the first part of the story was done. But the consequences were only just beginning. Just beyond the parking lot, Megan Carter moved smoothly, her steps precise and quiet, as she slipped into the driver's seat of a black pickup truck parked in the shade. She closed the door softly, her face calm, but focused. Megan, 38, former SEAL, was no stranger to reading situations fast, and what she had just witnessed at Patriot Arms was enough to make her pulse sharpen. She reached for the slim earpiece resting in the center console, fitting it into place with practiced ease. Her fingers moved over the dash controls, tapping a hidden panel, activating a secure channel. The faintest green light blinked once. She pressed her thumb lightly to the mic clipped under her collar. "Phantom team confirm location," she said softly, eyes fixed on the front of the gun shop. There was no static, no delay. A deep, steady voice came through almost instantly. "Megan, we read you. What's the situation?" Her jaw tightened slightly as she watched the staff inside the store laugh among themselves, the glass window reflecting their careless gestures. Target was present, disrespected, marked, sending location. She tapped the small tracker on her phone, which instantly relayed coordinates through a silent data stream. "Estimate 1 hour to arrival. Roger that. Phantom team inbound." Megan exhaled slowly, her fingers drumming once on the steering wheel. This wasn't anger. This wasn't personal. It was protocol, an old promise made by men and women who understood one simple truth: no one gets left standing alone. Outside, the Arizona sun blazed down on the lot. Inside the shop, Mike, Pete, and Sarah still lounged behind the counter, oblivious. Jason the guard leaned casually by the door, arms crossed, eyes half-lidded. They had already forgotten the old man with the limp, the one they'd mocked and pushed aside. Megan's truck stayed parked in the shadows unnoticed. But across town, silent signals had been set in motion. Black SUVs were pulling out from separate corners, merging onto highways, speeding toward a single point on the map. They moved without sirens, without lights, their tinted windows hiding the determined faces inside. A few blocks away, the young man who had filmed the earlier scene stood on a street corner phone, still in hand, live streaming now. His voice trembled slightly as he caught sight of the convoy approaching. "Yo, you guys are seeing this, right? What the hell is going on? Who are these people?" The comments on his stream flashed rapidly, viewers pouring in, hungry for answers. No one knew yet, but they were about to find out. Back at Patriot Arms, the staff remained blissfully unaware, their laughter echoing faintly behind the glass. But outside, the first SUV rolled into view, its black paint glinting briefly under the harsh sun before it pulled up smoothly to the curb. Another followed, then another, engines purring low, perfectly timed, perfectly coordinated. Megan tapped her earpiece once, lips barely moving. "They're here." Inside the shop, Mike leaned on the counter, chuckling at something Pete had said. "Relax," he muttered, shaking his head. "Nothing's going to happen." But outside, the storm had already arrived. Exactly 1 hour after Rick Lawson had been shoved out of Patriot Arms, the first black SUV rolled silently into the parking lot. Its engine purred, low windows, dark tires gliding smoothly over the asphalt. A second followed right behind, then a third moving in perfect formation, without a word, without flashing lights, without drawing attention in any loud or obvious way. But people noticed. Across the lot, the young man who had been live streaming earlier stopped mid-sentence, his phone now trembling slightly in his hand. "Oh man. Oh man," he whispered, his voice crackling on the feed. "Something's happening. Who are these guys?" The doors of the first SUV opened in a smooth, synchronized motion. John Hawk Hawthorne stepped out first, 50 years old, his frame broad and solid, his face set with the calm, hardened focus of a man who had led countless operations in places no cameras ever reached. The sun caught the gold seal trident pinned neatly to his collar, but he wore no fanfare, no medals, no uniform beyond his steady, deliberate presence. Behind him came Scott Alex Tyler and Marcus, the youngest of the team. At 26, his eyes sharp and clear, his movements disciplined. 12 men in total, each carrying an air that needed no introduction. Without a sound, they closed their doors, regrouped, and began walking toward the shop entrance. No one barked orders. No one needed to. Each step was measured, precise, the kind of silent synchronization that made even casual onlookers pause mid-motion. Customers still in the lot instinctively stepped back, their conversations halting as they watched the approaching formation with wide, uncertain eyes. Inside Patriot Arms, Mike leaned on the counter, half laughing at something Pete had just muttered. Sarah scrolled through her phone, feet propped casually on a stool. Jason, the security guard, stood by the door, arms crossed, still projecting the same dismissive stance he had worn all day. The chime over the door rang softly. Mike looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly, as the first two men stepped inside, and then the others followed. The store fell into sudden, absolute silence. Customers who had been browsing near the shelves froze their hands halfway to merchandise, eyes locked on the newcomers. Sarah's fingers stilled on her phone screen. Pete straightened sharply, his smirk fading. Even Jason shifted uncomfortably as the air in the room thickened, a quiet tension wrapping around every inch of the space. John Hawthorne stepped forward, his boots landing softly on the linoleum floor. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, scorched flag patch. Its edges frayed, its colors faded from long use. Without a word, he placed it gently on the counter. His voice, when it came, was calm, low, and controlled. 1 hour ago, one of us walked through this door. Mike's breath hitched slightly. Pete shifted his weight from foot to foot, his earlier confidence evaporating like mist under a rising sun. John's gaze moved steadily across their faces. He didn't ask for attention. He didn't demand respect. He only wanted to hold a memory you dismissed, a memory you mocked. From the back of the store, a customer whispered to no one in particular. "They don't even have to raise their voices, and I'm still getting chills." John set both palms flat on the counter. "You didn't ask who he was. You didn't care. So now we're here, not to threaten you, not to take revenge, but to make sure you understand what you turned away." Marcus, the youngest SEAL, stepped forward, placing a weathered black and white photograph beside the flag patch. 8 men stood in the picture, their arms slung over one another's shoulders, their faces sunburned and lined with grit and sweat. And in the center unmistakably stood a younger Rick Lawson, his half-smile both sharp and quiet. Mike swallowed hard, his throat dry. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. We didn't know." John nodded slowly. "Exactly." For a long moment no one moved. The SEALs held their formation, quiet and composed, as the weight of their presence settled into the room like a storm cloud. Then, in unison, they turned and began walking toward the exit, their steps as measured and steady as when they had arrived. They hadn't raised a single voice, but they had left a silence behind that no one in the room would ever forget. At the counter, the scorched flag patch and black and white photo sat side by side, their silent presence heavier than any weapon. John Hawk Hawthorne stood directly across from Mike, his eyes steady, his face unreadable. Pete stood to the side, arms slack, his usual cocky grin long gone. Sarah near the register had set her phone down completely, her wide eyes flicking from the photo to John, then back again. John let the silence stretch just long enough. Then his voice, low but cutting, broke it cleanly. 14 hours, he said quietly. That's how long he walked. 14 hours without rest, with a hole in his side, carrying 2 wounded men across enemy ground. No backup, no radio, just determination. Mike's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. John's gaze moved slowly from Mike to Pete. He pulled 3 of us out that day. I was one of them. We wouldn't be here if not for him. Pete took a shaky step back, his throat working hard. We didn't know, he stammered. His voice cracked on the last word, thin and strained. John's eyes locked on his, sharp and unflinching. Exactly, he said simply. You didn't ask. The weight of those words hit harder than any punch. Mike's hands twitched faintly at his sides, his earlier authority now gone drained out under the pressure of the moment. Sarah bit her lip, visibly shaken, her usual detachment shattered. Without raising his voice, without making a single threat, John delivered the message cleanly, one they would carry long after this day was over. Marcus, standing just behind John, stepped forward carefully. He set another photograph on the counter, this one newer, a color-shot desert sand in the background, a tight group of seals with arms draped over each other's shoulders, sweat streaking their faces. And right there in the center again was Rick Lawson, older now, but unmistakable. The silence thickened. Mike's shoulders slumped, his mouth moving as if searching for something, an explanation, an apology. Anything but no sound came. Pete ran a shaky hand through his hair, his chest rising and falling too fast. Sarah crossed her arms tightly, as if trying to hold herself still, her eyes glistening faintly. Without another word, John gave a small, measured nod. As one, the SEAL team turned their boots, landing lightly on the tile floor. They didn't rush, didn't look back, just moved as a single unit, the same silent presence they had brought in with them, now following them out. Inside Patriot Arms, the air stayed heavy, thick with something none of the employees had expected. Not fear, not even shame, but the cold, undeniable realization of who they had shoved aside, who they had laughed at, who they had failed to recognize. Outside, through the wide glass windows, the first SUV door swung open, waiting. And as the SEALs reached the exit, the store remained frozen, a place marked forever by the quiet truth that had just fallen on them like a hammer. Within minutes of the SEAL team leaving Patriot Arms, the first blurry photos hit social media. Someone outside the store had snapped shots as the SUVs pulled in, capturing the unmistakable line of silent, disciplined figures walking through the glass doors. By the time the first Facebook post went live, Twitter and TikTok were already ablaze. Megan Carter, now back in her truck, uploaded a single post to a private veteran group, a photo of the scorched flag patch, and Rick Lawson's old SEAL photo beside it. The caption was simple: Rick Lawson, Ghost Walker. That name rippled like electricity. Within 15 minutes, thousands of veterans across the country began resharing the post, adding their own stories, their own memories. Threads on Reddit filled with frantic typing comments piling up by the second. Someone dug into old military archives and found Rick's sparse public record Bronze Star, Silver Star 38, confirmed extraction missions, countless others listed under classified tags. No book deals, no interviews, no media appearances. Just a man who had done the work and walked away. On Facebook, a single post gained traction fast. That man once pulled 3 Marines out under fire. One of them was my uncle. He never even told the family who saved him. We only found out years later. Another veteran chimed in. He's a legend in our circles. We used to hear stories about Ghost Walker when I was still active. Never thought I'd see his name go public. Screenshots of the SEAL team's quiet stand inside Patriot Arms spread across TikTok, some with dramatic voiceovers, others letting the raw silence speak for itself. The hashtag #ChurchOrGhostWalker began trending, filling timelines with stories of sacrifice, brotherhood, and respect. Twitter caught fire when someone posted Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart, and some kid in a gun shop thought he was just an old man wasting time. Let that sink in. The post racked up tens of thousands of retweets within an hour. By evening, local news stations picked up the story. The lead headline read, "Silent Legend Local Veteran Draws SEAL Team Response After Gun Shop Incident." A polished anchor summarized the known details on live TV voice carefully measured between disbelief and respect. What we know so far, she began, is that Rick Lawson, a decorated SEAL veteran known by the call sign Ghost Walker, entered Patriot Arms earlier today for a simple request. What followed has sparked a national conversation about how we treat our veterans and who we choose to notice. But as the networks scrambled to put the pieces together, one question lingered on every platform, in every comment thread, on every news broadcast. Where was Rick Lawson? While the online world surged forward, desperate for quotes, reactions, or a public statement, Rick himself had slipped away far from the cameras and questions. No one could find him for comment. No reporters had tracked him down. He wasn't answering calls, wasn't checking social media. He was nowhere, and that more than anything made the story burn hotter. The man at the center of the storm wasn't seeking attention. He wasn't asking to be defended or celebrated. He wasn't even present to see the wave of recognition rising in his name. The headlines kept multiplying, but none could answer the question that now hung heavy across every screen: where was the ghost walker? By the next morning, Patriot Arms had transformed into something no one could have predicted. The once ordinary storefront now stood as a quiet memorial, its entrance lined with bouquets of fresh flowers, small American flags tucked carefully between candle jars, and handwritten notes folded beneath stones to keep them from blowing away in the Arizona breeze. People gathered in loose lines along the sidewalk, not to shop or browse, but to stand silently at the window to press a hand softly against the glass or to bow their heads before stepping back into the sun. Veterans came in uniform, some old and hunched, others young and sharp-eyed. Families brought their children, explaining softly why they were stopping what this place meant now. Inside, Frank Dempsey, 60 years old, and the actual owner of Patriot Arms, moved slowly through the aisles. He hadn't been there the day of the incident. He'd entrusted the store to his younger staff, Mike, Pete, Sarah, Jason, who now stood clustered near the back, pale-faced and silent, too shaken even to pretend they were still working. Frank didn't yell. He didn't slam fists or throw accusations. Instead, he walked quietly to the counter where the scorched flag patch and the photographs had been left the day before. He ran a hand slowly over the smooth glass, his face lined with thought. Without a word, he unlocked the display case, carefully lifting out the M1 Garand, the same model Rick Lawson had quietly asked to hold. Frank placed the rifle on the counter, its polished wood glowing faintly under the lights. Then he reached for a small frame and with a felt-tip pen wrote a single line on a plain white card. Gently, he slid the card into the frame and set it beside the rifle. He once carried this. Now we carry the memory. Outside, the crowd grew thicker. A man in a faded marine jacket stood at the window, saluted, once then quietly walked away. A family with young children lingered for several minutes, the mother kneeling to explain the sign in hushed tones. One small boy, no older than 7, tugged at her sleeve and asked in a whisper, "Mom, was he a superhero?" The mother's face softened as she looked into the window. "Yes, sweetheart," she murmured. "The kind you don't see in the movies." Frank watched it all unfold through the window, his jaw tight, his eyes glistening faintly. Behind him, Mike, Pete, Sarah, and Jason stood awkwardly, shoulders tense, their eyes darting nervously toward the door. Frank didn't turn to them. He just murmured softly, almost to himself. "We didn't ask his name. That was our mistake." More people arrived. Some left patches from their own units, pressing them gently against the window pane. Others set challenge coins or folded pieces of paper marked only with the word respect. News cameras stayed at a respectful distance, capturing the steady flow of townspeople paying tribute, telling stories, standing in quiet reflection. The shop no longer felt like a place to buy and sell. It had become a monument not just to Rick Lawson, but to something larger, the invisible sacrifices the stories too often left unspoken, the lives quietly lived in service, and then quietly left behind. And somewhere across town, away from the cameras, the crowds, and the makeshift memorial, the man they were honoring continued his day, as he always did, far from the spotlight, far from the noise, walking alone through the dawn. Across town, far from the crowds gathering at Patriot Arms, Rick Lawson walked his usual morning route. His steps were steady, measured the slow, slightly uneven pace of a man whose body carried old injuries, but whose mind still moved sharp and clear. He passed familiar landmarks, the rusted industrial fence, the weather-worn benches near the park, the corner diner with its sun-faded sign. His canvas bag hung over his shoulder, and his SEAL Team 4 cap, old and faded, sat snug on his head. Rick didn't glance at the newsstands he passed, didn't stop to check the headlines blaring from storefront televisions. He knew by now that his name was everywhere, his face, his record, his story. But fame was a currency he'd never wanted. At Riverbend Cafe, Emma wiped down a table near the window, her eyes drifting repeatedly toward the door. She had been working there for over a year, and every day Rick Lawson came in at the same time, ordered the same black coffee, and sat at the same booth in the back. Until now, he had been just another quiet old man, polite, reserved, alone. But today, Emma knew she was serving a man the whole country was suddenly trying to understand. The bell over the door jingled as Rick stepped inside. A few heads turned, recognizing him instantly now, though no one said a word. He gave a faint nod toward Emma and made his way to the corner booth. She brought over his usual coffee without needing to ask, setting it carefully on the table. For a moment, Emma lingered, unsure if she should speak. Then, gathering her nerve, she asked quietly, "Mr. Rick, I saw you, on the news, online, everywhere." She hesitated, wringing the edge of her apron nervously. "Aren't you proud that everyone knows now that they finally see you?" Rick looked up slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting hers. There was a faint smile on his lips, not amused, not dismissive, but soft and knowing. He gave a slow shake of his head. No, he wasn't proud. No, he didn't need anyone to finally see him. Emma nodded, swallowing hard. "Okay, sir," she murmured, backing away gently. She returned to the counter, watching from a distance, still turning it over in her mind, how a man could carry so much history, so much weight, and ask for so little in return. At a table near the window, an older man in a Marine Corps cap raised his coffee cup slightly in Rick's direction, a small, respectful salute. Rick caught the gesture, nodded once, then returned to his coffee. He opened his folded newspaper, but his eyes stayed distant, his mind elsewhere. Outside, the morning light gleamed against the windows, reflecting off passing cars, off storefront signs, off the polished black surface of an SUV, pulling smoothly to the curb. Emma's brow furrowed faintly as she noticed it. Then another SUV parked just behind the first, and a third pulling in quietly, lining up with practiced precision. Inside the cafe, conversation faltered. A fork clinked softly against a plate and stayed still. A spoon stirred absent-mindedly in a cup of coffee, then froze. Emma's hands tightened on the edge of the counter as the cafe collectively seemed to hold its breath. The bell over the door chimed softly as the first figure stepped inside. John Hawk Hawthorne, square-shouldered, clean-cut, his eyes scanning the room with calm, calculated ease. Behind him followed Scott, Alex, Tyler, Marcus, 12 men in total, the same SEAL team that had walked into Patriot Arms just a day before. They didn't wear uniforms, didn't carry weapons, didn't make a sound louder than the soft fall of their boots against the old linoleum floor. But their presence rippled through the cafe like a current, unmistakable and undeniable. Every head in the room turned slightly, eyes darting between the door and the corner booth. John stopped a few steps short of Rick's table. For a long moment, no one spoke. They didn't need to. The weight of recognition of shared history hung thick in the space between them. Then, from among the group, Marcus, the youngest of the SEALs, his voice carefully steady, stepped forward slightly. "Sir," he said quietly, "if it's all right, we'd like to sit with you." Rick looked up, his mouth curling just faintly at the edges, the shadow of a smile flickering there before it softened back into the calm, quiet expression he always wore. He gave a single slow nod. Without hesitation, the team pulled up chairs, sliding into the booth, filling the space without ceremony, without explanation. They didn't crowd him, didn't swarm him, didn't try to turn the moment into something it wasn't. They simply sat as if they had been sitting with him all along, as if they belonged there, as if the world outside had no say in what this moment meant. For the next hour, no one in Riverbend Cafe heard a word from that table. Customers watched carefully from behind newspapers, from across coffee cups, from the corners of their eyes, but no one intruded. Emma worked quietly behind the counter. Sneaking glances, she tried not to make obvious, her chest tight, with something she couldn't quite name. Awe, maybe, or pride, or the quiet ache of realizing she was witnessing something few people ever got to see. The Marine at the window set his cup down, softly, gave another small salute, then left without a word. Other customers slipped out their footsteps, gentle, as if afraid to disturb the air. Outside, the SUVs waited, engines idling low, their dark windows gleaming faintly in the sunlight. Inside, time seemed to stretch, and still wrapped in the unspoken weight of loyalty, brotherhood, and respect. Rick Lawson didn't speak of his past, didn't hold court over war stories, didn't lecture or explain. He didn't need to. His presence was enough. His team's presence was enough. And in that small, quiet cafe on the edge of town, surrounded by the people who had come to honor him without fanfare, Rick sat as he always had, steady, grounded part of something larger than himself, something no headline or viral video could ever capture. For the first time in years, he wasn't sitting alone. And that for Rick Lawson was all that had ever truly mattered. After the black SUVs had disappeared down the street, Riverbend Cafe sat in a kind of stunned quiet. No one rushed to leave. No one reached for their phones. The air hung heavy with something unspoken. Not shock, not fear, but a reverent stillness people rarely shared in public. Emma leaned against the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped down an already clean mug. Her heart raced her thoughts, whirling, but she stayed where she was, too aware that she had just witnessed something extraordinary, the kind of moment most people never get to see in real life, only read about years later. In the far corner, the older Marine who had been quietly observing all morning dabbed at his eyes with a napkin. He stood slowly walking to the window to gaze out at the empty street, then gave a small firm nod to no one in particular. Without a word, he slipped out the door, his steps measured his back straighter than it had been when he entered. The rest of the cafe exhaled gradually. A young father leaned across the table to explain softly to his daughter what they had just seen. A group of college students who had been working on laptops in the corner quietly packed their bags, their faces thoughtful, whispering among themselves about the old man in the back booth. Rick Lawson sat quietly for a few minutes longer, finishing his coffee with the same deliberate calm he always carried. He folded his newspaper, adjusted his worn jacket, and gave Emma a soft nod as he left. No grand gesture, no final look back, just the same quiet acknowledgement he offered every morning. By the time Rick stepped into the sunlight and made his way down the street, the conversation inside the cafe had already shifted from stunned silence to quiet retelling. "That was him," someone murmured. "That was the ghost walker. I heard he saved over 30 people in missions no one's even allowed to talk about. Did you see the way those SEALs sat with him? They didn't need cameras or speeches, just presence." Across town, the ripple spread quickly. By late afternoon, social media posts began to appear, not from anyone inside the cafe, but from people who had seen the black SUVs, people who had heard whispers, people who had watched the SEALs file in and out with no fanfare. A teacher at the local middle school told her students, "You might have walked past this man without knowing, but today, the most elite soldiers in the world reminded us all why humility matters." She printed out a news article that was circulating and taped it to the classroom door, where students crowded to read about the silent tribute given to a man they'd never noticed before. On veteran forums, posts exploded with activity. Rick Lawson, aka Ghost Walker, honored by SEAL team at local cafe. No press, no cameras, just loyalty. He saved my cousin's life in '91. I never even got to thank him, but those men did it for all of us today. This is what real brotherhood looks like. Quiet, loyal, unshakable. The story spread beyond military circles. Parenting blogs picked it up. Teach your kids this: the loudest people aren't always the strongest. The strongest ones stand quietly until the world makes space for their truth. Local news stations ran the story with simple headlines: a cafe, a veteran, a lesson in loyalty. The day a town learned who walks among them. Reporters struggled to find photos, quotes, interviews. There were none. Rick had declined every request. No one inside the cafe had taken pictures. There were no viral clips, no viral hashtags, just word-of-mouth retellings and reflections. And somehow that made it all the more powerful. By evening, small gatherings formed across town, veterans meeting quietly in community centers, old friends sitting together in bars, families at dinner tables discussing what had happened. Parents explained the meaning of respect to their children, not as something shouted or demanded, but as something lived proven and quietly upheld. Emma sat at home, late that night, staring at her phone, scrolling through the countless posts, the flood of tributes, the heartfelt messages pouring across the internet. She closed her eyes, remembering the way the cafe had felt, the air heavy with meaning, the hush that had settled over every conversation, the way no one had wanted to break the spell by speaking too soon. For Rick, it was just another day. He walked home the same way he always did, his boots steady on the pavement, his silhouette small but sure in the fading light. He didn't turn on the news. He didn't check his phone. He didn't wonder what people were saying. Because for Rick, recognition had never been the goal. He knew who he was. His team knew who he was. And now quietly, without fanfare, the world was starting to understand too. By the time the stars rose over the small town that night, the story had reached places Rick would never visit, touched people he would never meet. And everywhere in small private corners of the world, strangers paused to reflect on a man they'd never known, a man who had lived quietly, served fiercely, and when the time came, been honored not with headlines but with presence. Presence, after all, was all he had ever needed. Across town, the story of Rick Lawson had moved beyond whispers and retellings. It was quietly reshaping the very places people gathered every day. At the local high school, a social studies teacher stood before her class, holding up a newspaper article titled "A Quiet Hero" and the Town That Nearly Missed Him. She looked at her students, some leaning forward, others resting chins on their hands, and said softly, "This is why we pay attention. This is why we ask people stories." She gestured toward the classroom door, where she had pinned a photocopy of the article with a handwritten note below. Real strength isn't loud. In the school hallways, students traded versions of the story between classes. "Did you hear Seals just walked into Riverbend Cafe to sit with that old guy who goes on morning walks? Yeah, I heard he saved a whole team in the 80s. My dad said that man helped during Panama, maybe even places no one talks about." At the town's Veterans Hall, a group of older men gathered, many of them in worn jackets with faded patches, quietly passing around printouts from military forums that had blown up overnight. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Each one had his own story of someone like Rick, someone who had served without asking for thanks. But this time, they saw the town noticing, saw the next generation paying attention. Then, one morning, the principal of the high school received an envelope. It was unmarked with no return address, the handwriting on the outside careful and neat. Inside was a single letter, unsigned, recounting a mission from 1987, a mission no one had ever heard about, buried deep in military files, where Rick Lawson had led a small unit to rescue captured allies across enemy lines, walking for miles under fire, refusing extraction until every last soldier was accounted for. The principal read the letter twice, sitting alone in her office. Heart-pounding. She knew she couldn't confirm the details. She knew she couldn't trace the sender. But she knew what she wanted to do. That afternoon, she called in the school's custodian and had the letter framed. She hung it just outside the main office where every student, every parent, every staff member would walk past it. Below the letter on a simple brass plate were the words, "Ask the name before you forget who kept you safe." Word spread quickly. Local reporters picked up the story, fascinated by the anonymous letter, the framed tribute to the school's decision not to name the man, but to honor the message. New headlines appeared. "A town reflects one man. One act, one change. From silence to reverence. The veteran who taught a town to listen." In City Hall, a quiet conversation began between council members. Should they organize a formal tribute? Should they create a public day of recognition? But the more they talked, the more they realized Rick Lawson himself would never stand for it. He wasn't a man who wanted stages or ceremonies. At the Veterans Hall, a new kind of meeting emerged. Not formal events, not big public displays, but small private circles where old friends shared memories, honored names that hadn't been spoken in years, and made sure those names wouldn't be lost. Online, the military community watched with deep respect. Posts carried captions like, "One man reminded a town what loyalty looks like," and this is how you honor the quiet ones. Back at Riverbend Cafe, life settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. People still glanced at Rick when he came in for his coffee, but no one crowded him, no one asked for autographs, no one pestered him for stories. They just let him be exactly as he preferred. Emma, wiping down the counter one afternoon, caught herself watching Rick as he read his newspaper. She wondered for the 100th time if he even knew how much had changed because of him, if he realized the conversations he'd sparked, the small, profound shifts in the people around him. But Rick gave no sign. He sipped his coffee folded, his paper nodded politely when he left. He remained in every visible way exactly the same. And maybe that, Emma thought, was the most powerful part of all. Because while the town adjusted, while schools framed letters, while headlines flashed briefly and then faded, Rick Lawson didn't chase attention, didn't step into the spotlight. He walked the same quiet path home, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, head slightly bowed against the breeze, as if the world's sudden fascination had never touched him at all. That night, under the hush of a cool, windless sky, Rick Lawson walked back toward Patriot Arms for the first time since everything had unfolded. His steps were measured, his silhouette blending into the quiet streets, the brim of his old SEAL Team 4 cap casting a soft shadow over his lined face. The shop stood ahead, its lights softly glowing against the darkened storefront, no longer just a place of business, but now a kind of unofficial monument, a reminder of what the town had almost overlooked. Flowers still rested outside in small, respectful bunches. A folded note pinned to the window simply read, "We remember." Inside Frank Dempsey, the shop owner looked up as the bell above the door jingled. He rose immediately, not with a rehearsed speech or a dramatic gesture, but with quiet purpose. His hands were steady, his face thoughtful, his voice calm as he said softly, "Evening, Mr. Lawson." Rick gave a faint nod, stepping forward, his boots making almost no sound on the polished floor. Frank moved to the counter and carefully lifted the M1 Garand, the very rifle Rick had once asked to hold, the same one that had sparked everything that followed. Cradling it gently, Frank stepped around the counter and faced Rick directly. For a long, still moment, neither man spoke. Then Frank offered the rifle forward, his hands open. "Thank you," he said, his voice low but steady, "for reminding us what we should have remembered all along." Rick's eyes softened his expression, shifting just slightly enough that anyone watching could see the weight of memory pressing behind them. Slowly, reverently, he reached out and laid one hand across the worn stock of the rifle, his fingers moving lightly over the wood. His other hand brushed the barrel for a second, as if feeling not the weapon itself, but the years it represented, the history, the sacrifice, the quiet burden he had carried without complaint. His throat moved once, his jaw tightening briefly, his eyes glistening faintly. But he didn't speak. Instead, he gave Frank a small, deliberate nod, a gesture that somehow conveyed more than 1,000 words could. Frank, understanding perfectly, nodded back. No handshake, no applause, no staged moment for cameras. Just two men standing in the soft light of a gun shop late at night, recognizing something deep and unspoken between them. Near the door, unnoticed, until now, the young man who had filmed the very first clip, the one that had sparked the town's awakening, stood silently watching. His phone stayed in his pocket this time, his eyes wide and filled with something closer to reverence than excitement, stayed fixed on the simple, quiet exchange in front of him. He exhaled softly, almost a whisper, and murmured under his breath, "He doesn't need to be celebrated. He just needs to be remembered." Outside, the town lay still, the streets empty, the stars hanging sharp and bright overhead. And inside that small shop, under the glow of soft, unassuming lights, Rick Lawson stood for one last moment with the rifle he had once carried, the man he had once been, and the quiet, undeniable truth that had finally, after all these years, come back home. No speeches, no music, no headlines, only the kind of silence that makes you swallow hard, the kind that leaves your chest tight, the kind that says everything words never could. That night, after Rick Lawson stepped quietly out of Patriot Arms, the town seemed to hold its breath. The streets were empty, the air cool, the only sound the soft shuffle of his boots on the pavement. He carried no fanfare with him, no applause followed his steps, just the quiet, steady presence of a man who had long ago learned to walk unnoticed. Inside the shop, Frank Dempsey watched Rick disappear down the street. Across town, behind dimly lit windows, people sat silently at dinner tables, at cafe counters, at veterans' halls, holding the weight of what they now understood. No one chased Rick. No one stopped him. They all knew his story was never meant to be a spectacle. It was meant to be remembered. The scene faded to black. A narrator's voice, calm and reflective, rose softly. Some stories are too quiet to shout, but they're the ones that matter most. The video began. Slow-motion footage played the empty corner booth at River Bend Cafe, the darkened storefront of Patriot Arms, the framed letter at the high school hallway. Over these images, the voice continued. Have you ever known someone like Rick Lawson? Someone who gave everything not for medals or headlines, but because it was right. The montage shifted to clips of the community, a teacher taping a tribute letter to the school wall students, pausing in the hallway to read it. A veteran placing a hand gently on an old photo at the local hall. A family sitting quietly at home, explaining to their children why the town was talking about a man they had never noticed before. The narrator's voice softened. We live in a world that often rewards noise, but every community, every family, every life is shaped by the quiet ones, the people who carry weight without asking for credit, who stand watch without demanding thanks, who shape the world quietly, fiercely, and leave it better because they were here. Footage rolled through Emma, wiping a tear from her eye behind the cafe counter. Frank Dempsey in his shop, carefully returning the M1 Garand to its place. The young man who filmed the first viral clip standing outside at night phone, tucked in his pocket, his head bowed slightly, absorbing the gravity of a moment too big for words. A classroom scene flashed on screen where a civics teacher pointed to the framed, anonymous letter recounting the 1987 rescue mission. The camera panned over students' faces, curious, thoughtful, quiet. The narrator asked gently, Have you ever met someone like Rick Lawson? A grandfather? A neighbor? A friend? Someone who shaped lives quietly, whose absence would leave a hole bigger than their presence ever asked to fill. On-screen bold text appeared if you have tell us their name. A pause. Share their story. Keep their memory alive. The montage quickened user-submitted videos, comments, posts from around the world. A woman smiling softly into the camera. My Uncle Jack. Vietnam. He never told anyone what he did. A teenager typing my neighbor, Mrs. Garcia. W2, medic. She raised me like one of her own. A veteran standing by an old gravestone hand resting on the top for Charlie, who saved my life twice. I'm here because of you, brother. The narrator's voice carried forward, low and sure. This isn't about going viral. This isn't about headlines. This is about making sure we don't forget the people who carried us here. About asking the names before they're gone. About honoring the weight they've carried in silence. Soft music swelled in the background as the footage returned to Rick. His silhouette walking under a fading sky, his figure small against the wide stretch of road, his steps steady, sure, and unhurried. The final message appeared on screen. Some men don't need a spotlight. They just need to be remembered. The narrator spoke once more, voice gentle but firm. If you believe in keeping these memories alive, if you believe in honoring the quiet heroes among us, leave a comment, share a name, tell their story, and let's make sure they are never ever forgotten. The screen faded to black. A last frame appeared. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. We'll see you in the next story. No dramatic outro, no flashy animations, just silence, the kind that lingers, the kind that fills the room, the kind that asks you to sit still for a moment longer and think about the names, the faces, and the quiet heroes you might have walked past, never knowing, never asking. And across homes, classrooms, veterans' halls, and quiet streets, people did just that. They remembered. They reflected. And they made sure in that simple act that Rick Lawson's story and the stories of countless others like him would not fade quietly away. Across the town of Fairhaven, life slowly settled into a new kind of rhythm. Patriot Arms, once just a storefront tucked between a hardware warehouse and a bait shop, had transformed into something more. People still came in to browse rifles, scopes, ammunition, but they walked a little slower now, their eyes drifting toward the simple glass display where the M1 Garand rested quietly beside a framed plaque. The plaque didn't list medals or wars or numbers. It bore just a single line. He once carried this. Now we carry the memory. Visitors didn't crowd the display. They didn't take selfies or pose dramatically. They stood for a few moments, hats in hand, eyes lowered, then moved on their footsteps, soft against the wooden floor. Frank Dempsey, the owner, watched it all from behind the counter, his hands folded, his eyes thoughtful. Down the street, Riverbend Cafe had become another quiet landmark. Emma, now known around town for having served coffee to a man who had quietly changed everything, worked her shifts with a new kind of care. She didn't try to explain what had happened to newcomers. She didn't tell long stories or boast about the viral posts. She simply made sure the back booth, Rick Lawson's booth, was always clean, always ready. Locals who had once overlooked the old man now paused when he entered, offering a small nod, sometimes even just a respectful glance. Rick, true to his nature, never made a show of it. He nodded back, maybe let a faint smile tug at the corner of his mouth, then sat quietly to read his paper, sip his black coffee, and watch the world move around him. At the local high school, the framed anonymous letter still hung in the main hallway. Students passed it every day, some pausing, some whispering, some asking teachers. Is that really about him? The answer was never written down. It didn't need to be. The brass plate below the letter said everything. Ask the name before you forget who kept you safe. In the Veterans Hall, small circles of old friends gathered more often now. They didn't organize big events or public tributes. They sat together in worn chairs, trading quiet stories, polishing old photos, making sure the names they remembered wouldn't slip away. And in the middle of it all, Rick Lawson continued his life exactly as he always had. Each morning he walked his 2-mile loop through town, his cap pulled low, his canvas bag slung over his shoulder. He passed familiar houses, familiar shops, familiar faces. People who once glanced past him now paused slightly, maybe lifted a hand in a small wave, maybe gave a polite, "Morning, Mr. Lawson." Rick answered with a soft smile, a tilt of his head, a quiet acknowledgement. He didn't linger. He didn't invite conversation. He simply moved forward one step at a time, the same way he always had. Inside his modest home, tucked at the edge of town, there were no trophy cases, no framed medals, no shelves lined with awards. On his dresser, a single photograph sat in a plain wooden frame, 8 men, dusty, sunburned arms slung over each other's shoulders, their eyes hard, their smiles faint. In the center, unmistakable even decades younger, stood Rick the Ghost Walker, the man whose name had once only been spoken in hushed, respectful tones among those who knew. Rick didn't stare at the photo often. He didn't need to. He carried the memories with him, quiet and constant, like the weight of an old pack slung over his back. What mattered was never the crowd, never the applause, never the headlines. What mattered was that his team remembered, that the people who needed to know knew. And now quietly so did the town. There was no ceremony, no parade, no official day on the calendar marked Rick Lawson Day. There was just a quiet shift, the kind you can only feel, not see, in the way people moved, the way they looked at one another, the way they remembered to slow down and ask the names, the stories, the truths that so often went unspoken. On a crisp autumn morning, Rick passed the young man who had filmed the first viral clip, the one that had started it all. The young man hesitated, hands buried in his jacket pockets, eyes wide with the weight of recognition. Rick offered a faint nod, a soft, knowing smile, then kept walking. And that was enough, because in the end, some people don't need to be celebrated loudly. Some people don't need speeches or banners or official honors. Some people only need their teammates to remember, and for the rest of us not to forget. The camera panned slowly over the town, capturing the shop windows, the school hallways, the cafe booths, the Veterans Hall, the quiet streets where Rick walked. A final frame appeared, Rick himself, his silhouette small against the setting sun, his figure steady and sure, his steps as unhurried as ever. A single line rose on the screen, white text against black. Some people don't need applause to be recognized. They only need their brothers to remember and for us not to forget. No dramatic score. No fade into a trailer for the next episode. Just the image of a man walking home, carrying decades of service sacrifice and loyalty on his shoulders, not demanding to be seen, not asking to be praised, simply trusting that those who mattered knew, and that the world for once had paid attention. The screen faded slowly to black. There was no to be continued. There didn't need to be, because this story in its quiet, steady, unshakable way had already found its end, not with a roar, not with a spectacle, but with the simple, satisfying knowledge that some names will never again be forgotten. Thank you for staying with us through the story of Rick Lawson, the man they called the Ghost Walker, a man who reminded an entire town, and maybe all of us, what true respect, true loyalty, and true humility really look like. We've taken you through the quiet streets of his town, past the shop windows, the cafe booths, the school hallways, and the veterans' halls that all now carry echoes of his presence. But as you've seen, Rick never asked for attention. He never wanted headlines. He never waited for applause. What mattered to him, what has always mattered, was that his brothers remembered, and that the people who had once looked past him now saw him, truly saw him, even if only in a small, quiet way. This story wasn't about a single moment of glory. It wasn't about medals or viral clips or awards on a wall. It was about the power of quiet presence, about the strength of standing beside someone without needing words, without needing the world to notice, about how one man's integrity carried across decades could ripple outward and change the hearts of people who never even knew his name. And now, as this story draws to a close, we leave you with this simple question. Who is the Rick Lawson in your life? Who is the quiet hero? You know, a family member, a friend, a neighbor, a colleague who has carried weight without asking for credit, who has shaped your life, your community, or your world, not through loud gestures, but through quiet, unwavering loyalty and strength. We invite you to share their name in the comments below. Tell us their story. Let their memory, like Rick's, be honored and kept alive. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of remembering those who serve silently, we invite you to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to our channel for more human stories that remind us of the values that truly matter. Because in the end, stories like Rick's don't just belong to one town, one cafe, or one group of veterans. They belong to all of us. They remind us to slow down, to look twice, to ask the names before they're gone, and to honor the people who have given more than most of us will ever know. Not because they wanted to be celebrated, but because they knew it was right. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to follow the next stories.